Good afternoon. And on behalf of the partners, I would like to welcome you to Forum 4. My name is Jane Oates, and I'm the president of Working Nation. Our partnership, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and Upskill Houston, we're really proud that you came today, and we're proud to give you an unbelievable look at infrastructure needs. If we're able to do everything that we plan to do, we're going to need an infrastructure that enables all these innovations to thrive. Remember, our goal is to make financing higher education, post-secondary education, reskilling and training available to everyone. I would like to give a special thanks to our sponsors today. We're sponsored by JP Morgan Chase, the Microsoft, Google.com, Cognizant US, and Schmidt Futures. We couldn't be here without them. Thank you very much. And please enjoy the day, stay engaged, use the chat function, and certainly join us. This is a movement. You'll hear Jason Tisco say this later, and we need you. If we're to achieve our goal of making being competitive in this workforce a reality for every single person, we need every one of you to join us. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Tishko, Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and its foundation, and I'm excited to join you here today for Forum 4 in the Talent Finance series. Just to give you a little bit of context where this conversation sits with respect to the ones that preceded it, we launched the initiative last week with the release of the Talent Finance White Paper last Monday, and then we had two forums. We had our kickoff event, which kind of went through very broadly, the recommendations, the themes, the topics in the paper, profiling some of the examples of what we mean by talent finance innovations for both upside opportunity and downside risk management. From there, we held a conversation between the Chamber and SHRM about partnership development and how we want talent finance to be a network of action and what it's going to take to build partnerships all across the country to explore the talent finance ecosystem and to support it and help it thrive. When we talked about the kinds of partnerships we needed, we set up this week's conversations. And just this past Tuesday, we had our first discussion around partnerships that are really focusing on the innovations themselves. Who are the organizations that are actually being the tip of the spear when it comes to designing new and innovative talent finance solutions, and how are they putting them to work for businesses, for workers, and for learners? We heard from a number of experts who are doing this work already, but also what they need in order to continue to innovate and to scale. So these are the folks that are doing the work on the ground. They're engaging in pilots, they're engaging in demonstrations, and we need more of that. So we want, per the framework that we shared with you all, the full universe of talent finance innovations. We want to bring them to bear on the talent marketplace, and we need more pilots and demonstrations all across the country. We need to be working together, learning together, and sharing best practices. So that was the first group of partners that we wanted to highlight, focusing on the innovations themselves, whether they're income share agreements, lifelong learning accounts, outcomes-based financing, new income and employment insurance products. The list goes on. But today we're going to be focusing on the other side of the coin, and that is a deeper look into the enabling infrastructure and ecosystem that is going to support those talent finance innovations. So that's the goal for today, is understanding that these pilots can remain very boutique. They can also just never really have an opportunity to scale, but for an enabling infrastructure that supports them. So what we want to introduce you today is what are the topics that we teed up in the paper that we want to discuss as part of this initiative to say, if we're going to pursue more and better talent finance innovations, what are all the component parts that need to be in the ecosystem that will enable them to flourish and scale and to implement that, in a high quality way. So that's the focus of today's discussion. If we're able to pull up the slides, I just want to level set a little bit on kind of where we started. We started with the white paper that framed this discussion. We introduced the framework, which tried to capture all the very issuers and beneficiaries. within the talent ecosystem and how they can access new and innovative finance solutions to pursue their goals. We made sure that we weren't just talking about any finance innovations, but really trying to put some important guardrails in place with guiding principles so we understand kind of what are those, when we design a finance innovation, how do we make sure it's actually promoting equity? How do we make sure it's affordable and accessible? How do we make sure it's enabling choice and empowering workers, as well as enabling choice for businesses and who they're going to work with? We introduced 16 recommendations, so a comprehensive overview of all the different component parts of the talent finance ecosystem, but importantly, which one of those are also focusing on the enabling infrastructure to support them. And we shared examples. So that's the paper. That's what's grounding us in today's conversation. If you haven't had a chance to read it, we encourage you to go find it. We've included the link for you there. We encourage you to give it a read. If we go to the next slide. I wanted to focus again on the framework. You could access this framework on page 22 of the document I just highlighted. And what I really want to stress with this framework is there's a whole ecosystem of finance solutions that are out there, both for upside opportunity, education, training, and credentialing, and upskilling, but also for downside risk management. So what are those instruments we need to manage volatility in the new economy? So we're not just investing in skills, but also managing the risks of the new economy such that if you're experiencing fluctuations in income or earnings, you can protect yourself against it. So we're talking about both and we're talking about all the different finance instruments and how to make them more public and private and how to improve upon them. Well, as we're talking about that entire ecosystem, we do mention in the paper that this ecosystem captured within this framework is supported by an enabling infrastructure that includes performance metrics, risk metrics, data systems and data infrastructure, and a wide variety of quality assurance mechanisms. So today we're going to dive deeper into that piece and start teeing up what are those component parts of the enabling infrastructure and why are they important when it comes to talent finance. Next slide. So here we have an introduction to the enabling infrastructure. And I'm hoping to be joined by my colleague, Bob Sheets, to have a conversation around these. But I understand he's having some technical challenges, so he may be joining us shortly. But here are just a few of the topics and themes that we highlighted in the context of the paper. So if we're going to pilot and scale talent finance innovations, what are some of the things we're going to need to improve upon? The first one is human capital accounting and reporting. We want to make sure that the practices are in place to appropriately document when employers and when others actually invest in training and credentialing. We want to document that, and we want to make sure that we're building the right incentives such that employers and the business community is always encouraged and incented to invest in their workers and never discouraged from that. And there's been a healthy debate about how we capture this within HR accounting because employers, as they invest in talent, they don't treat those investments per accounting practices the same way they treat R&D, for example. It is considered a cost or an expense, and that leads them to be discouraged from accounting it as such or from investing more in it. We need to change that. If we are in an economy that competes on talent, and talent is a key driver of our competitiveness, we need to treat talent and account for talent the same way we do other types of investments. So we think there's a lot of work to be done on the private sector side, but this needs to be a public-private solution. And we need to create new data standards and new standards for how we report out on these investments so we get better intelligence on who's investing what and what kind of outcomes it's achieving. The next one is quality assurance systems. So not just HR accounting, but making sure we understand that if we're going to enable choice in the talent marketplace and bring new finance instruments, we need to have the right quality assurance systems in place, and not just one, but could be many, that are signaling out to those issuing those finance solutions which programs get the best outcomes for learners. And which programs can actually be engaging in a solution that carries less risk. So we think there's a very important aspect of the quality assurance systems that need to be reporting on outcomes because outcomes are critically important. They're going to inform the risk infrastructure. They're going to inform the finance solution, but we need new and better quality assurance systems that can actually speak to the new talent finance innovations that are going to be out there. And if we want to give workers and learners more choice about which programs they go to, the finance solution needs to follow the learner in the pathway they've chosen, regardless if it's an accredited college or university or an approved workforce program. What we need is good outcomes data, good quality assurance for the entire training infrastructure, Then we should let learners take the finance solution they choose to pursue the pathway that they choose, but we know it's high quality. The next one is LERs and data infrastructure. LERs are important, learning and employment records. You're hearing a lot about them right now, a comprehensive record of learning, a universal transcript, one that is digital, one that can be linked to an individual so they can carry their learning wherever they go and use it for continuing employment and education opportunities. But a full inventory of the skills and competencies attained, regardless of where they've learned them, on the job, in school, or elsewhere. So as we're thinking about this emerging learning infrastructure, we need to leverage it to now inform how we manage talent finance investments. So as we produce these new records of learning, we will know more about where learning happens and with what outcomes than ever before. And as we de-identify and aggregate that data, that is going to inform the talent finance products of the future. We will know more about which pathways and which combination of learning, which skills get what kind of outcomes in terms of employment and earnings. And that is going to be a powerful source of data for informing how we move new finance products in this space and how we de-risk them. The next thing I wanted to tee up is the risk infrastructure. In the financial services industry, they know how to identify, measure, assess, and score risk. They do it all the time. And it helps inform the right investment strategy or product for an individual, whether you're buying a home, a car, or something else. We don't have the equivalent when it comes to the talent marketplace. And now's the time to do it, because by assessing, scoring, and identifying somebody's risk, that is not something that is to be done punitively. But it says, until I understand the context in which you're operating and the unique set of risks that are converging on you, I can't do anything about them. So what is the new risk infrastructure, the new talent opportunity score that's going to inform a wide variety of lending and investment practices that could actually be used not to hurt equity, but to actually help us achieve, for once, a more equitable talent marketplace? We think now is the time to have a conversation about the new risk infrastructure that can actually be leveraged to promote equity. Next, employer networks and collaboratives. What we mean by this is in the Chamber's work, but others are doing things that are similar. We have been doing the hard work of getting employers to engage in collective action. And as we get them to engage in collective action, we want to make sure that they are taking advantage of opportunities to engage in joint procurement and purchasing of new talent finance solutions. We have our talent supply chain networks all across the country. They're in 33 states and Canada. If we had dozens, if not hundreds of them becoming test beds for new finance solutions, it would be an incredible experience. And much like under innovations like the Affordable Care Act, where chambers and other associations can actually get companies to come together to purchase healthcare solutions, we should be doing the same thing for talent finance solutions. We talk about income share agreements, for example. Well, imagine if you had dozens and dozens of companies and collaboratives jointly funding their own ISA accounts and having them managed through an association of their choice. Lots of opportunity here if we have a national network of employer collaboratives that could become test beds for new talent finance strategies and solutions. And then last but not least, state and federal policy. Policy is a big piece of this, and we know it cuts both ways. There are certain activities that we're going to need to engage in to clarify the regulatory environment at the federal level, but we're going to have to do it at the state level as well. And we think there's opportunities to not just clarify the regulatory environment and remove barriers from more talent finance innovations taking root, but we also need to make sure we're understanding in the new public-private talent finance ecosystem, as the private sector is putting more skin in the game and being more strategic about how it's leveraging these talent finance innovations, where can government align with those investments and braid their resources with the private sector? So we think it's another opportunity to kind of rethink the state and federal role, not as the funder or lender of first resort, but as a partner and a participant in a wide variety of private sector solutions that are trying to bring better finance options and opportunities to more learners and workers. So lots of different component parts of the infrastructure. What I really like about the talent finance lens in all of this discussion is it brings it all together. Any one of those areas highlighted on that slide could be pursued independently, could be its own standalone effort or conversation. What we are excited about after 8 years of work building up our workforce portfolio is this is the first time we see all of these things converging together with a common outcome, being creating the environment where new talent finance innovations could take hold, so we have the right talent finance ecosystem that's fit for our time, our labor market, and our economy, not one that was built for the past. So that's the topic for today. And my ask of all of you, my call to action is, We need partnerships in this space. We want to partner with those who are actually piloting and demonstrating solutions on the ground. We want to tell their story. We want to celebrate them. We want to learn from them. And we want to be a partner in helping them scale. But in order to be that partner, we need to work with a set of stakeholders, public and private. We need to work with leaders in their respective spaces to come under this talent finance umbrella and now say, what is the work to be done around quality assurance? What is the work to be done around data infrastructure? What is the work to be done around human capital accounting and reporting? So on and so forth. So this is our ask of all of you. We want to build partnerships all over the place. And we want to work with the folks like social finance and others who we heard from earlier this week. But we also want to work with those folks who know this infrastructure and who could help us co-design it and create it in a way that's going to enable innovation in the talent finance space. So I'm sorry Bob Sheets could not join me today, but hopefully I did this conversation justice. And with that, I am going to now invite our team to pull up a pre-recorded interview with Ashley Watts, who's president and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. And what you're going to hear from her is a little bit around that enabling infrastructure when it comes to emerging employer networks and how powerful they could be. And from there, we're going to invite a panel of experts who are going to talk through a number of the different areas that I highlighted in this opening presentation. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will rejoin you at the close.
We are thrilled to be joined by Ashley Watts today. She's the president and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. We're going to talk a little bit about talent finance and talent pipeline management, and are very happy to have Ashley joining us today. I'd like to start off by just asking you, Ashley, our paper on talent finance argues that the economy has fundamentally changed, and that means that we need to rethink how we finance and fund and create training programs for that new economy. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how the economy is changing and what that means for finance.
Well, thank you first off for having me. It's an honor to be here. And yes, I think we all can agree over the last 6 months, our economy has fundamentally changed. And the way that we have done business and that we think about employment has changed. We've heard it said that technology has kind of sped up what would probably take 5 to 10 years. We had to adjust to in about 6 months. And so for us at the Chamber, I think that's what we've really noticed, is that employers all across Kentucky have had to keep up with the technological changes and kind of how that impacts the way we do work. We've also had to realize what happens when we don't have, in-person education or quality childcare available. Here in Kentucky, many schools are still shut down. And so the workforce implications for working parents who are also trying to homeschool their children has been a challenge as well. So major challenges that we faced in Kentucky that I know other states have faced as well. Talent is the new currency. And especially now that we know that many people can work from home, they can work remotely. I think that looks very different these days on what attracts people to certain professions or to certain jobs. I myself have 2 young children, and so I used to always say it was work-life balance, kind of making sure that you could work and that you could have your family and that you're balancing everything. And in this new world we're living in, which is so technological, and that we can connect via Zoom and by phone and all the new advances that we've seen, it really is more of an integration, a work-life integration. And so I think here in Kentucky, we're seeing employers really look at work-life integration and making that important to the workforce that they're trying to recruit.
As you think about this initiative a little bit and some of the innovations in finance and the public and private partnerships that we propose, how do you see some of those things helping some of those students who have stopped out, the adults and learners that have some student loans? How could things that we talk about in the paper help some of those, or in the future kind of create new opportunities for workers?
I think so. And here in Kentucky, we've partnered with the U.S. Chamber. We really have had a public-private partnership with state government on this initiative. And so right now, looking at a workforce kind of turned upside down and very high unemployment numbers and people being, left with large student loans, we are partnering with the state right now. We're partnering with our community and technical college system on upskilling, on trying to figure out how to help these people get employment when we know we have much needed positions that need to be filled. So I think we actually have here in Kentucky a really good model of private business, such as the chamber and other employers really coming to the table and working with state government, working with local community colleges and universities to make sure that we're working together, collaborating, having that conversation to really make it a public-private partnership model.
Tell me a little bit about how you all got started in the talent pipeline management work. What brought the chamber and the business community to the table? What brought the state government to the table? And tell me a little bit, as you look to the future, how you all think that some of the new financial models and ideas that are coming out of this project could help advance that even more.
We were one of the first 3 states selected to really kind of be the pilot project for talent pipeline management. I guess that was about 2 years ago. And so in that time, we took that partnership that we had with the U.S. Chamber, we had the TPM model, and we went to state government and said, we think we can really, create a great service here that would be beneficial to you all. And they decided they would fund it. And so through funding it, we have now several staff members here at the Kentucky Chamber who we call TPM managers, and they manage a part of Kentucky. And in just the last 2 years, there are now 30 industry-specific collaboratives across Kentucky that are active, that are engaged, that are communicative, that we've been working with.
Ashley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Stuart, and thank you to the U.S. Chamber for being such a great partner to us here in Kentucky and giving us the model of talent pipeline management that we have been able to implement here in Kentucky. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name's Peter Beard. I work at the Greater Houston Partnership and lead our workforce development efforts. It's a pleasure to be here today because I get to welcome 3 great people to begin building out some of the work that Jason was referring to. First, we have Kristen Sharp, who's with the Education Quality Outcomes Standards Board. We're also joined by Matt Gee of Bright Hive. And we're also joined by Alex Alonso from the Society for Human Resources Management. And so what we wanted to do today is really kind of delve into this whole idea of the enabling infrastructure that's necessary to kind of scale the work that we're talking about. And I think Ashley began to hint at it, which is you need kind of density of folks doing work in the workforce space. But in order to really scale, we've got to think differently about the standards. And so really delving into this whole issue of around kind of the incentives and the accounting of human resources becomes important. The whole notion of quality assurance, so people understand the quality to it, and really the data infrastructure that's necessary to share all the information so people can make intelligent decisions. And then we'll spend a little bit of time really kind of delving into kind of this risk issue that Jason referenced. So what I'd like to do is engage in a conversation with Matt, Kristen, and Alex, and I'm going to ask them to kind of take a short bit of time to tell us a little bit about their organization and what interests them about talent finance. And why don't we start with Kristen?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks very much to the Chamber for creating the Talent Finance Initiative and bringing together all of the stakeholders to discuss it today. I'm really pleased to be here and think that it's an important topic. The Education Quality Outcomes Standards Board is a nonprofit quality assurance organization for accelerated and non-traditional education and training programs. We focus on evaluating providers by the real-world outcomes for their learners. So the economic prospects that people get as a result of going through a program, completion rate, placement into a job, earnings bump, the learning that they have that benefits the employers that they're working with eventually. This in turn allows employers, states, and funders to be able to assess their return on investment by having a consistent framework across all different kinds of programs for real-world based quality. I'm really excited about the Talent Finance Initiative because I think that focusing on quality assurance that is outcomes focused can really get us to a QA process that's neutral on the kind of education and training program that can produce good outcomes and allows people to have more choices about the kinds of programs that they pursue.
So thanks, Kristen. Matt, could you give us a sense of kind of what Bright Hive is all about and why you're interested?
Sure. Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks for letting me be part of this great panel. So Bright Hive is a data collaboration company. So we focus on the messy business, legal, and technical issues we call the BLT sandwich that you run into whenever two or more organizations are wanting to combine their data for some sort of shared purpose. And we're partnered with the U.S. Chamber on a number of key data infrastructure initiatives at the ecosystem level, including the T3 Innovation Network, the Job Data Exchange, and the Open Skills Network. And in doing this work over the years with the Chamber, we have talked often about how all of that core low-level data infrastructure work really has financial innovation as one of its core end goals, because data and finance go hand in hand. In a former life, I was a data scientist at the US Treasury during the credit crisis. And I saw firsthand both the financial innovations that can spring out of data innovations, as well as what happens when the balance of data power gets way out of whack. And so one of the reasons that we're so excited to be supportive of and be part of this effort is we feel that the way that the Chamber and partners are approaching talent finance is learning from some of those mistakes of the past and approaching talent finance and the data infrastructure conversation in a very holistic and inclusive way.
So thanks, Matt. And I think that's a really big piece of it. What are the learnings? And Alex, I think many of us know about the Society for Human Resource Management, but I think you bring a rather unique perspective to this. So I'd like to hear a little bit about why SHRM is interested and what specifically you're interested in talent finance.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the Chamber for having me here. I guess my perspective is quite a bit more pragmatic. As the Chief Knowledge Officer for the Society for Human Resource Management, we've taken an interest in talent finance in large part because it plays an important role in enabling HR professionals to do their jobs more effectively. And candidly, when we think about what the biggest challenge that exists for HR professionals, it's really mastering the art of talent acquisition and talent retention as well as development. And so as we think about this, we represent over 1.6 million HR professionals alone, just the generalist population, all of whom are trying to do their part to ensure that they are supporting their employer community, but also their employee base in what is an effective management, if you will, of all the learning capability that exists, but beyond that, also what it is that they can accomplish. And when I think about talent finance, and Jason brought this to our attention as a society, one of the things that struck me was that we had an opportunity to really arm HR professionals, but beyond HR professionals, employers with standards, quality standards for learning data that was just necessary. It hadn't existed before. And quite candidly, this was an opportunity for us to arm a workforce more adeptly than we've ever done before. So.
No, and I think that's helpful. And if we bring everybody on, but I think, Alex, you also play a different role in SHRM because you're also accrediting professionals that then have to have those proficiencies, which, an employer is relying on them to be able to do that. So I think you have a very interesting perspective that shows up in the quality assurance. So let's kind of take the discussion and let's look at it from the learner perspective and really what needs to be in place for the worker or learner as and maybe starting with Kristen around the outcomes and results and the interests the learner and worker have in that.
Yeah, so right now we don't have a system where every different type of program collects and reports data on its outcomes. And we definitely don't have a system where they're all doing it according to the same categories of data collection. So for learners, it is really hard to be able to compare different kinds of programs and the ROI that they get in different programs on that basis. So our goal is, and I think the hope in talent finance and sort of more broadly in the industry, is to get to a point where everybody's collecting the same kind of data so that people can analyze how much time, effort, and money it costs in order to go through that program and what you get as a result. Does it help you get a job? Does it help you get a promotion in the existing organization that you're in? Do you have sort of greater knowledge of the industry as a result of having gone through the program? And I think just having that baseline kind of data collected will be really helpful to the learner and worker.
And so, I mean, as we also think about it, how do we put the good quality assurance systems in place? And I think, Alex also looks at it from the folks that have to make a decision about folks that came out of those programs.
So, the interesting thing to me is that my background is as an industrial organizational psychologist, an IO psychologist. And it's funny because I think of the world of testing and credentialing, and we have such zeal when it comes to reporting and standards as far as it relates to testing and assessment, right? And in psychology, we've got standards that have been instituted now going on 150 years. And what strikes me is you can ask most basic people in the general public what at least 2 or 3 of those standards are, and each of them will tell you there's got to be fairness, there's got to be quality assurance, there's got to be some reliability and some validity, right? The issue that strikes me when we think about the problem that lays ahead for us with learning programs and educational programs in particular is while we have those same desires, we don't have that institutionalized view of standardization around them. And what I would love to see is exactly what Kristen was describing, is those types of institutionalized standards. So to me, this is the first step in really helping accomplish that. As a consumer and as HR professionals, it also makes my job easier if I have an idea around what the return on investment and what the return on learning is, the return on not just investment or workforce investment, but also the return on engagement that someone might have from participating in a given program. Those are all metrics that just don't exist today and aren't really institutionalized in half of what we do.
No, and I think that's right. And as we look at this, I think Matt suggested we should be looking for where the learnings are. And certainly, at the time, I suspect you were in Treasury, we were in the middle of the financial crisis, and there had to be standards that were either overlooked or we should have anticipated in the future. I don't know if you have a comment before we kind of transition to another focus area, Matt.
Yeah, I think, there is one of the things that is a key learning from that era is that when you have information silos and data silos, those things break down, right? It was very hard to have a shared view across the ecosystem of what was happening and what wasn't happening. And I think one of the really encouraging things about the standardization work that Kristen and Alexander have talked about is standards are one of the key ways that you break down those silos. You can shine light where it's necessary and get information flowing where it needs to.
Because I think one of the learnings was consumers who got a mortgage and believed a bank wouldn't give them a mortgage unless they were going to be successful in the mortgage in many respects. And I think that's part of this quality assurance system, is that people are getting validated information so that they can actually think about the risks that are inherent to it and not just rely, well, they gave me the mortgage, therefore I must be able to pay for it. And so, as we think about it, we should also now begin to think about what needs to be in place from the employer's perspective to help them, in many respects, de-risk and ensure that they're getting the quality the same way as we're also supporting the workers. Because at the end of the day, when we think about talent pipeline management, there are two end users of the system that we're confronting. There's the employer that really is, where everyone's trying to get, but then there's the learner worker. And so I want to focus on that other end of the spectrum to say what needs to be in place to give some assurance of quality to the employer. I don't know whether you want to build on that, Alex, or we can just have a conversation generally.
Well, I think part of what really stands out to me is thinking about the notion of transfer of learning, right? And what we can do as an employer community to really enable that type of transfer of learning. To me, the piece that's missing with every particular point, or quite a few learning programs out there, or the learning programs that we employers are consumers of, is not just the data and how effective those programs are, but what are the conditions that I have to provide as an employer to ensure that someone can take that learning that they've attained and bring it back to the workplace and actually make something from it. And so as we think about the data quality standards that exist with all learning programs, part of what I would love to see is a transfer of training conditions kind of protocol or manual that would exist. The other piece that really strikes me is, and is sort of important from an employer perspective, and was sort of called out in some of the work that Jason has been doing, is we need a workforce that supports this. Because at the end of the day, Peter, what you're describing is an actuarial system. And forgive me, I'm the son of 2 actuarials, so I'm going to go ahead and get a little nerdy with insurance. But part of what strikes me is, if we really are thinking about talent finance, we are trying to develop an actuarial system around talent finance in an area where we have not had the metrics or the tools to really assess this before. So if you ask me, we're talking about burning the candle on both ends by saying we have to think about what it makes someone, a learner worker, successful when they get back to the employee workspace. But the other side of the coin is, how do we make the employer much more savvy in using this type of information?
No,
sorry, Peter, should I?
Go ahead, Kristen.
So it's really interesting, Alex, to hear you talk about that from the employer's perspective, because I come from a government future of work, sort of social impact side of things, where it's talked about as, for the learner, what's the last mile skills that one needs to have in order to transition somebody into being successful in a workplace. And so what you're trying to assess in a quality program is not just the learnings, but also whether there is the last mile coaching, mentoring, getting somebody ready for what they will actually be doing and how they'll be applying the tools that they learned in their program. And so one of the things that I really like about the EQUO certification process is that in one of the data collection categories, learning, we're trying to get to a place where we can assess not just the certification, like actual skills. Did you learn to be a welder? Do you know what the temperature you have to have fire at? But also, are you able to apply that skill and use discretion in your workplace? And so being able to work with industry and work with employers to set out what the learning themselves are, and then how you use those learnings is really important. And I think we have to get to a place where quality assurance looks at both of those things.
And I would also suggest, Alex, that there's some data and information an employer should be thinking about how to communicate backward into Kristen's system, which are, what are the attributes and competencies that are inherent to someone's ability to be successful in that role, which may never show up in the educational side, but shows up because they have great attention to detail. And how do you measure that and help someone know what they're going to actually need to be successful? So there's still probably a huge data gap in this space.
Just to build on that, Peter, you're exactly right. One of the key data infrastructural innovations that needs to accompany these talent finance innovations are really new public-private data collaboratives. An example of this, we've been working with Ivy Tech Community College System, the Indiana Chamber, the state, and an existing collaborative of Indiana employers that came together. They had a shared goal of just being able to say, we have a set of employer-funded upskilling and reskilling programs. We're putting the investment into this, and we want to understand our return on investment. And in digging down into what data was needed in order for those critical ROI measures, or return on investment measures, to be measured for just the employers who were the primary payer, it turned out that the data they needed was marbled throughout not just their HR information systems, but also IB Tech's learning management systems, and even government agencies' administrative data, like unemployment insurance records. And so the data gaps are both within some of the HRIS systems, and employers can and should be enhancing their own data, but we've got to find better ways for these local collaboratives to be able to stitch together their data to get that rich picture that's needed to create that kind of holistic and comprehensive view for finance.
No, and I think that's right, is we've got to bring all these different pieces of data and also identify the absence of certain data. And Alex, I don't know if you want to comment on kind of this whole notion of, what makes a good safe truck driver goes beyond just what they're trained in school.
One of the things that strikes me, Peter, is that that is the very question, right? It's understanding not just what it is that one does to really examine or understand what they've learned, but also what we do to then assess how they continue to engage in that type of performance. So what are we linking to, or how are we validating later performance, if you will, in terms of what someone has learned? And then beyond that, what are we doing to kind of assess how credentialing programs, now that we're talking about credentialing programs, also how they are contributing to a person's individual learning? Because Matt, you raised an excellent point around there are disparate sources of information that really kind of inform this equation that we're trying to build. And I think about credentialing agencies as a whole who have many maintenance kind of standards or records that are required. So for instance, with SHRM certification, someone is required to earn 60 credits to ensure that they are continuing their professional development. But how does that align with what their performances? How do we tie that to their continued employer outcomes? And what is it that we do to report back to that private public kind of collaborative, right? Those are the things that are missing, is how do we do those different pieces? Because that's another animal in that ecosystem. It almost makes me hearken back to, and I share this only because of my professional experience, but it makes me hearken back to my days with the Army Research Institute, where a significant component of what we were doing to support them was trying to understand how it is that what they learned in the military could be translated into civilian life and the civilian kind of workforce, but then beyond that, how you actually went about sustaining those skills so that they were not lost over the course of time. And so it's a recurring theme. I wish we had the will and the resources that the Department of Defense had to kind of really commit to that. But that's the challenge that lays ahead.
And so important a point as we continue with sort of lifelong learning and constant need to and upskill and get people into different positions, even within their own organizations. I love the concept of being able to do long-term tracking and matching up with data of whether someone is continuously learning and how they're applying that continued learning.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions when I interview folks, which is what have they done most recently to enhance kind of their skill set or awareness, or what did they learn new? I'm going to take another pivot because the third leg of this stool is the investor. And, we've been talking about risk, and, Jason hinted at it, Matt hinted at it, which is, the investor who's putting money in wants to get an ROI, but we also have to be pretty good about kind of sussing out the types of risk. And of course, Alex just talked about his parents being, actuaries, which is how insurance companies make decisions, which is to understand and underwrite risk. So let's have a broader conversation related to kind of what should we be thinking about as we think about the investor and ensuring that we're helping them with their risk issues. Matt, you worked in Treasury.
I'm happy to jump in on this. Yes, I think, so interestingly enough, I've had a number of conversations over the last month with insurers, actually, interestingly enough, that are employer benefit insurers who are thinking a lot about what insurance products they might innovate in this category. And one of the really interesting things is they've started to look at the risk and risk profiles for their kind of aspect of novel talent finance, is that a lot of actuarial analyses, as well as the way we typically do a lot of individual loan underwriting, is focused on individual risks, right? What are, for that individual profile, what are the risk factors? And one of the really important differences in talent finance is that the risks are actually, the largest risks are actually in different categories and tied to things other than that any particular individual. For example, what is the risk that the skill that you get trained on gets automated away in 6 months with the release of a new AI update from OpenAI? Right? This is a very real risk. But the interesting thing is it's also increasingly quantifiable. And so the thing that I'm really excited about is that a lot of the firms have been focusing on maybe future of work data products targeted mostly at employers, thinking about their workforce planning, are starting to think about how might they use those same data assets and their ability to forecast some of those critical reskilling risks and have those be inputs into the actuarial analysis of some of these financiers.
I think that's such an interesting point, because to me, that breaks down into, in assessing risk, you need to assess both the institutional and situational risk as well as the individual risk. And the institutional and situational risk is, the skill that you have gained through the particular institution or program that you've gone through, right? It's also the institution that you're going to, as we've discussed, do they have the supports in place to allow you to be successful there? But then there's also sort of an element of individual risk and individual initiative, maybe. I was talking to an education provider, a coding boot camp, just the other day, who said that one of the number one indicators of will someone complete the program successfully is whether they successfully complete the initial questionnaire, just the intake stuff. Like, if they can follow directions well enough to complete the thing, they can probably figure out how to get through all and bring to bear all of the different skills and supports they need to get through the program. And so factoring in some of those individual risks too will be important. It's an interesting, almost three-legged stool.
No, and it is. And I think, Matt brought up this whole issue, when you're in financial services, you've got to manage the individual credit risk of who you're underwriting, but then you've got to manage, in essence, the interest rate risks that show up in the economy. Alex, I know you probably are just dying to jump into this conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting because the one thing that strikes me is we don't even have enough data truly to understand what the individual risks are. Right. And it's funny because I hear Matt talking about it and I hear Kristen, and they're excellent points in terms of what we're talking about. But what strikes me is, I think even from an employer community perspective, I don't think we do enough to collect data on individual differences and or individual development plans enough to really kind of inform that actuarial type activity. And so part of me, again, I hate to beat everyone with the data stick, but I think we need to get some standards around what's acceptable for those types of individual characteristics, because that's really what's going to drive the biggest variability in some cases when it comes to thinking about the variance associated with return on investment. So.
I completely agree. Just one quick note on this, just to pile on with Alex. Every conversation I have with a potential talent financier is, we don't have enough data for X, Y, and Z, right? And it's almost always at the individual level. One of the things that I think is really encouraging, that's a trend to watch in this, is what Jason pointed out in the introduction, the learning and employment records. These, I think, are our best chance at balancing those wonderful principles for talent finance around empowering workers, accessibility, equity-based, while also providing the richness of the data necessary to originate some of these new financial mechanisms. For folks who aren't familiar with this, they're essentially like electronic medical records that you own as an individual learner or worker, that you can carry no matter where you're working, where you got your last credential, and have your full learning and working history in a way that's verifiable enough for a financier to bank off of. And the really interesting thing about a lot of the pilots going on with these records is that they are so much richer than just, here's the title of my last job, here's here's the credential that I got. Folks are packing in really interesting information about socio-emotional learning, about on the job learning experiences, a lot more rich information in those learning and employment records that I think are going to be a necessary input to bridge that data gap.
And just to close out this segment, there's a reference, I think, in the paper to an organization called Fast Forward Works that is really trying to help bridge that gap between what are from a neuroscience point of view, what are the inherent capabilities of an individual that performs high at that level that would then also help a worker learner know whether they had those individual capabilities and whether that's a good path to go down. Because we know, when hospitals think about what makes for a good nurse, there are certain inherent qualities that you want to be able to measure and learn from before you put someone into that position. So I know we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to kind of get a sense from each of you very quickly. What do you think really, are you an optimist or a pessimist about some of the challenges we've raised today? Do you think we can achieve them, or is it like we're just going down a rabbit hole and shouldn't be going in that space?
Well, I'm just one of two. Okay, go ahead, Kristen. Sorry.
I'm a perpetual optimist. I think that and I'm optimistic about this for a couple of reasons. The first is that we are just starting to align around the fact that we want to be assessing outcomes rather than inputs in education and training. And that in and of itself is a great development. And secondly, we're starting to think about all the different ways to make lots of different choices of education and training providers comparable to one another, which doesn't exist at the moment. And everybody has a different kind of accreditation and certification process. So aligning around some baseline metrics of outcome-based standards is really helpful, and I think can get us a long way towards giving people more and more accessible choices. So I think we're asking the right question.
Alex, I think you were going to go, and then we'll go to Matt.
Thank you, Peter and Kristen. I couldn't agree more. My actuary DNA wants me to say no. I'm a pessimist all the way around. But what strikes me is, we do quite a bit of research on the state of learning, and what we've seen in recent years is an uptick in what it is that employers are looking for the demand on return on learning activities, right? And so to me, that speaks to a real interest on the employer community side. What is even more intriguing is what we've seen since the pandemic sort of accelerated some of our operational needs, right? And so I think about this, and I think specifically about what we're seeing in the world of reinvention. And what strikes me is that it's not just reinvention of enterprises, it's also reinvention of the workforce within enterprises or people who are formerly part of that workforce. So I'm actually quite optimistic that this is something that will help kind of propel us towards this new economy.
Thanks. Matt?
And I'll wrap up with another note of optimism. You might have just too many optimists on the panel, but I think from a enabling data infrastructure perspective, I'm incredibly optimistic because all of the things we've talked about, the data gaps we've talked about, and the ways that we can go about solving them are in production out in the field. Public-private data collaboratives are happening. Individual learner and employment records are happening, and they're progressing very, very rapidly. I think the work to be done by this community is to bring those great data infrastructure innovations, the great kind of standardization innovations that are happening, and the financing innovations that are happening, and bring them together. And I feel like that is imminently doable. That's happening now, and it's only going to accelerate over the next year. So I'm incredibly optimistic.
And I do have a final question, but I'm going to go in the weeds very quickly with Alex, because I think one of the issues Jason raised was related to the accounting standards in terms of, is it incenting or is it or is it disincenting certain types of behaviors that employers should have? And then we'll end up with the final question.
So in my mind, what we're seeing is, quite honestly, that we've not seen a scenario that has incentivized employers to do this, right? We've not, to some degree, we're seeing that employers are sort of disincentivized, in large part because they're thinking about this from the perspective of accounting as an accounts payable or accounts receivable kind of model. And I liken it more to our strategic finance, right? And I think specifically where we've sort of lost our way a little bit is thinking of this in terms of GAAP and what our controllers do, as opposed to thinking of it the way that our general management accountants and our strategic accountants actually go about their business, right? Which is thinking about the future and what investments we make. If I were to think specifically about what we'd love to see and where we're headed, I'd love to see us think of this more as the general management accountant would think of this, rather than, and a financier would, than thinking of it in the way that a controller would. Now, that may be a little bit in the weeds, but part of what we're seeing is a shift in the way that employers are perceiving these types of investments that lead us to believe that this is more of what I like to call a talent capex, right? And all of us know about our capital expense budgets. We're all going through our budgeting exercises right now, which is horrifically painful in some cases. But I think what we're looking for is how do we build a talent capex budget that is worth our while? And to me, that's the exercise that we need to retrain ourselves to invest in.
So the thing, and to leave Jason and the team here with, a question you really think needs to be answered. What would be that question from an enabling infrastructure point of view?
Who are you asking, Peter? Sorry.
Any of you.
Oh.
So I'm asking all of you at some level. Matt?
Sure. I think my one note sum on a lot of these conversations is the technology is always possible. The incentives are the part that are messy. So I think, to Alex's point, what's the kind of big question for me is what's the tipping point for a particular incentive within the network that changes, and how quickly can we get there?
Kristen?
We've talked a lot today about the fact that we don't have a process for collecting and reporting consistent data across the board right now. I think we need, and the employer community should really think through how to invest in a process for collecting preliminary data on outcomes for all different kinds of education and training providers at scale, just so we can get to the place where we're vetting them and thinking about how to deploy those options and what kinds of partnerships need to be in place to use them. We need an automated process or questionnaire, like a fast input process for people to be able to just get their data in one spot.
Good. Alex, close us out.
So, the thing that I would leave us with, and I couldn't agree more with Kristen and Matt, but what I would leave us with is thinking about how employers can invest in the workforce to support this kind of financial system or this talent finance system. And I raised the issue in large part, Matt, you probably have had an experience with this as a data scientist. We've all seen the problem that occurs when we have data scientists run amok without context, right? And so I think it's important for us to build an infrastructure that supports the infrastructure as well. So that's the one thing I would challenge employers to think about as they go through this.
So don't let the data scientists run the asylum. So Matt, Kristen, Alex, you all have been great today. And I really want to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Chamber Foundation, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and obviously the Greater Houston Partnership. You've been very insightful, and we look forward to the continued partnership. And I'd now like to turn it over to Jason to kind of close us out. Jason?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to our panelists. What I want to leave you with is that the talent marketplace is ripe for innovation, both for upside opportunity investments in education, training, and credentialing, as well as in downside risk management products like insurance. But that innovation will not take hold and scale absent enabling infrastructure. And that enabling infrastructure is going to be composed of new data infrastructure, new quality assurance systems, new policy, and many other things. And we at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation are committed to building the talent finance ecosystem of the future. We take on big challenges because we can. However, we cannot do it alone. We need your partnership. Together, we can change the incentives, and in so doing, we can change the talent marketplace. So this concludes Forum 4 of our 5-forum series. I would like to thank our partners again, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the Greater Houston Partnership, and Working Nation. I'd also like to thank our funders again, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft Philanthropies, Cognizant Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and Google.org. And I also like to thank our guests, our special guests today, Kristen Sharp, Alex Alonso, and Matt Gee. Thank you to all of you. And thank you to our audience. Your time is valuable, and we appreciate you sharing it with us and joining us on this journey. So thank you again, and we hope you could join us for our final forum. It will take place on October 13th. So we are going to have a week off. We are going to take everything we learned from these first 4 forums, and we're going to come back on the 13th for a full 90 minutes where we are going to have a capstone event. We're going to talk about our shared learnings, and we're going to talk about how to prioritize the work moving forward, who we're going to be partnering with on which recommendations and issues, and how to set our expectations for how we're going to work together to build the talent finance ecosystem of the future. So you're not going to want to miss that date. It's going to be a much more interactive session. We appreciate you listening to all of us, but now we want to hear from you. So we're going to build, it's going to be a different experience. You won't want to miss it because it's going to be your opportunity to shape the future of talent finance. It won't be your only opportunity, but it's going to be a great way to be part of the beginning of the discussion. So thank you again for your time. You have our contact information. You have our websites. Please reach out if this is a topic you want to stay engaged in. This is all about building a movement, building a network of action, and we can't take action without your partnership and support. Talent finance is not our initiative. It is your initiative. It is our initiative holistically. So we want this to become a shared brand, a shared effort, and a shared journey. So join us. And I look forward to connecting with all of you once again on October 13th. Have a great day.